really slow. Okay, so we're going to talk about completing the square for just a polynomial before we talk about using it as a method to solve an equation. So there's a process first. Today we're just going to talk about how to complete the square and then write the trinomial as a binomial squared. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about how to use that in solving quadratic equations. So first steps today is we want to complete the square if we have x squared plus bx. So for example, that could be x squared plus 8x, x squared minus 4x. So all we've got is those two terms, x squared and an x to the first. And we want to complete the square. And you'll understand why it means completing the square when we do that. So first step in completing the square for this is that you want to figure out what b over 2 is, because you'll be using that. So we want to find b over 2. And then the next step is we're going to add the square of b over 2 to our already existing polynomial of x squared plus bx. And then after we have added b over 2, that quantity squared, we'll be able to factor our trinomial, because we'll have a third term out here, a constant. We'll be able to factor that into something, a binomial squared. And this is going to be crucial for us in our solving quadratic equations. So there's the steps using all the variables or the unknowns or the letters. Now let's look at a few problems where we actually are going to put these steps into place. So we're going to complete the square for x squared plus 8x, and then we're going to write it as a squared binomial, because it'll end up being a trinomial, 3 terms, and we're going to put it as a binomial squared. So the first step, if you remember correct from up here, is that we want to figure out what b over 2 is. B is the number that's the coefficient for x to the first. So typically it's your middle term here. So b is 8, so we're going to figure out 8 over 2, which gives you 4, bless you. Okay, so that's what b over 2 is. We can leave it as just 4. It ends up being 4 over 1, but you can leave it as 4. And then the next step is to add b over 2 squared to our existing polynomial. So b over 2 was 4, so we're going to add 4 squared to that, which ends up being 16, correct? So just writing it, here, the first thing that I have boxed in is we've completed the square. So completing the square gives us the polynomial or the trinomial x squared plus 8x plus 16. That's part 1. And then part 2 is we're going to write it as a squared binomial. And so going back up to here, that will be x plus whatever b over 2 was squared. And what did we decide b over 2 was here? 4. So our second answer, where we're writing it as a squared binomial, is x plus 4, that quantity squared. So why does that work? How do we know that that's what it is? Well, we could come over here and we know x plus 4 squared is the same as x plus 4 times x plus 4. And then we could FOIL. You're going to get x squared plus 4x plus 4x plus 16, which gives us x squared plus 8x plus 16, which is what we had right here. So once we complete the square, it allows us to write our trinomial as a squared binomial, which is going to help us in solving quadratic equations when we complete the square. All right, next one. Let's complete the square for x squared minus 6x. Now I'll walk you through it again. So we want to do figure out what b over 2 is, and b is the coefficient for x to the first. And in this case, it's a negative 6. So we're going to take a negative 6 over 2, which gives you a negative 3. Now we have to square that and add that to our existing polynomial. So we're going to take a negative 3 and square it, which is going to give us a positive 9. So our first answer, our perfectly squared trinomial, is x squared minus 6x plus 9. And that can be rewritten, because we completed the square, that can be rewritten as, remember, we're going to take x plus b over 2 and square it. And so that's, I left off a parentheses here. That's x plus a negative 3. That quantity squared should have something right here. And then that is actually x minus 3 squared. So this factors this way, and we always write it as x plus b over 2, but then if b over 2 is a negative, it ends up making our factoring, or our squared quantity, a subtraction. All right, so same steps. We're going to figure out what half of b is. B is 3. Half of b is 3 over 2, and I want you to leave that in fraction form. If you can reduce it, do that, but if it doesn't come out to an even number or whole number, leave it in reduced fraction form, even if it's an improper fraction. Okay, so same rule applies then. We are going to add half of b squared to our existing polynomial. And when we square that, we're going to leave it in fraction form, even if it's improper. And 3 over 2 squared is 3 squared over 2 squared, or 9/4. So we have completed the square for that, and it is x squared plus 3x plus 9/4. That's our first answer. I should have boxed that in. I don't know why I didn't do that. And because we've done that, now we can put it into a binomial squared, that form. And remember, it's always x plus whatever half of b was. Half of b from up here, you see, is 3/2. So we can rewrite this as the quantity x plus 3/2 squared. So now we have something other than 1 in front of x squared. All of the other problems have been where we've had 1x squared. Now we have 2. We can't complete the square if it's 2x squared. So what we have to do is factor that 2 out. We have to divide each of the terms by 2, but pull that 2 out in front. So when I factor a 2 out of x squared, it's like dividing the 2x squared by 2. What do I have left when I take 2x squared divided by 2? 1x squared. And then I also have to divide the 20 by that 2. And that gives me 10x. So I'll complete the square for the polynomial that I have inside the parentheses. That is a 1x squared polynomial. And keep the 2 on the outside. Okay, don't drop that 2, because we'll be using it later on when we solve our equations, quadratic equations. Okay, so now you're really just concerned about what's inside the parentheses here. We use the 10. 10 is our b, not 20. 10 is the b that we're going to be working with. And we're going to divide it by 2. So 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then remember, with that 5, we square that, and that's what we're going to add. So we have 2 times that quantity, x squared plus 10x plus 5 squared. And we can go ahead and simplify that 5 squared to be 25. So don't drop the 2. We have to keep the 2. There's our first answer where we've completed the square for that, for the given polynomial. And now the next thing is I'm going to rewrite that as a squared binomial. Remember, that means we're going to put x plus b over 2, that quantity squared. And up here, b over 2 we determined was 5, so that's just going to be x plus 5 that quantity squared. And don't forget the 2 that we factored out to begin with. And so we have completed that square for that special polynomial. First step, we need to factor that 3 out. So we're dividing everything by 3. 3x squared divided by 3 is just 3. Then we take the negative 6 divided by 3 is 2. And now we're just concerned about doing what we've been doing in terms of completing the square with what's inside the parentheses. You should figure out what b over 2 is. Then we're going to put that squared, simplify, and then rewrite it this way. So get that put in your notes, and then I'm going to hand out the worksheet, which is your assignment for today as you're finishing this.